So Martin Luther gets the Reformation started in the early 1500s, right? Beginning with 1517, with the 95 Theses nailed to the door and sent to the Archbishop of Wittenberg Cathedral. The Reformation, we all know, does not just stop with Luther, right? The Reformation continues, and indeed it begins to encompass all of Europe, right? And different parts of Europe become more Protestant than others, right? And of course, right, Lutheranism is not the only form or only branch of Protestantism. So once the Reformation begins with Luther, the Reformation continues with other leaders throughout Europe. And I'm going to draw a quick chart here to just illustrate a little bit the type of changes that occur, right? So pre-1517, there was really only one church in Europe, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, there is a break when Luther comes around, right? So 1517 or so, well, probably later, 1520. But anyway, there's the break with Luther. Now, this change that occurs is a theological change, right? So I'm going to call this the theological branches. So what I mean by that are some of the things where you have a change to the Roman Catholic theology, right? The less importance given to the priesthood. There is less significance given to sacramental changes, right? There is the movement away from transubstantiation to consubstantiation, a greater focus on scripture and less on, again, the supremacy of priests and the Catholic clergy. Priests, ministers in the Lutheran religion can get married, right? And these theological changes continue, right? So when Luther is in Germany, right, but then this sort of Reformed theology goes into Switzerland, and you have a guy named John Calvin. And then it goes into Scotland, and you have a guy named John Knox, right? Calvinism, and this becomes known as Presbyterianism. Right, and then there's others, right? There's Zwingli. Well, Zwingli's before this, right? There's all of these different changes that emerge. Occurring a bit later, in the 1530s, you have the break that comes with the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Now, for the Church of England, this is not a theological change, really, right? This is much more of a political change. And you can tell that because it's called the Church of England, right? It is not a new sort of Lutheranism or Calvinism. It's not a new theological change. It's really just, where is the political apparatus based? And we're going to look at that in just a few moments. Now, what really changes here is who has the authority. And the answer is going to be here, not the Pope, but the King, or later, the Queen. So even today, right, Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of England, Queen of the United Kingdom, is the head of the Church of England, right? She is the defender of the faith. Now, the term the defender of the faith was given to her successors, right? And starts all the way back with Henry VIII. So let's look at what's going on in England, right? So in England is very different from the rest of Europe, right? The Catholic Church just does not have the same control that it has in other parts of Europe. And that's largely because England Britain, England, is separated by the English Channel, right? So the bishops and the princes of the church, right? The bishops, the cardinals, have a lot more autonomy in England and Scotland and Ireland than they do in other parts of Europe. Particularly if you think of a place like France, there's a lot of control given to the king over the church, but the church is very much still tied to Rome. That's less the case here in England. By the 1500s, right, there's a very strong monarchy based in London, and there's a lot of control given, right? Now, this map will show, right, so the purple area here shows us that this becomes the Anglican, right? Anglicanism sort of gets toeholds in Ireland, which is why, this is Dublin here, right? This is, today up in Northern Ireland, Belfast, right? That's why you have those areas today. And okay, anyway, we're going to be talking a lot about this guy, Henry VIII, and how his desire for a divorce, annulment, ultimately leads to the beginning of the English Reformation. So Henry VIII became the King of England in 1509 after the death of his father. Now, I should tell you a little bit about what brought the Tudor dynasty to the throne and why his reign becomes as contentious as it really does, right? So Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, comes to the throne after a series of wars called the Wars of the Roses. And it's not really important to get into the nitty-gritties of that series of wars, but it is important for us to think about sort of what that means as the outcome, right? So because his father had taken the throne after, after, again, a lot of contention, Henry VII really wanted to ensure the legitimacy of his line and not have to worry about a threat from outside the family. So Henry was very concerned with making sure that his family was again legitimate heirs. And what happens as a result is he's very much focused on establishing a male heir. So Henry VII has a first son names him Arthur, right? Again, sort of giving this Arthurian legend. Second son comes around and he names him Henry. Now, Henry was not given the same education that his brother was, given sort of a lesser education, again, because in the old style of rule, there was already the heir Arthur. Didn't necessarily need to worry about Henry. He was the spare, as they say. So Arthur gets married to the largest empire of the time. Arthur gets married to the second daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, right? The people who send Christopher Columbus across the ocean, right? So Catherine and Arthur are married. Arthur dies. And the leadership of England doesn't want to send Catherine back to Spain because then if they do, it would become a major this woman is the family member of the King and Queen of Spain. We can't just let her go. So what happens is they marry Catherine to Henry. Now, technically, this is not legal, right? Because Catherine is a widow, and she should not be permitted to be married to Henry. Also, she is his sister-in-law. Again, this adds problems. But anyway, Henry and Catherine are married. They are married for quite a few number of years, right? They try and have children. Henry comes to the throne in 1509, and Henry is known as the defender of the faith, right? He is the first person to be called the defender of the faith, and he is again trying to establish the legitimacy, just like his father. So Catherine and Henry wind up trying to have children. Catherine has a number of miscarriages and is not and does not carry many of their first pregnancies to term. Ultimately, she does, and she gives birth to a daughter named Mary. This aggravates Henry because he wants a son, right? So because of the sort of problems with conception and miscarriages, Henry ultimately wants to get an annulment. So he requests from the Pope an annulment, and instead of pointing it at her inability to bear children, he starts it with the idea that their marriage was illegitimate, that Catherine should not have been able to marry Henry because of her previous marriage to his brother. Petitions the Pope. Again, you have to think about this in a political sense, not a religious sense, right? The Pope can't, again, the most powerful empire in the world at the time is Spain. The Pope can't very easily piss off the King of Spain. So what do you do instead? You sort of figure out ways around it. The Pope just says no. And ultimately, Henry has to seek his own recourse. So the recourse that he seeks is he petitions his Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy named Thomas Cranmer, who is a reformer and who already had wanted to reform the Church of England or the Church in England, the Catholic Church in England, to be less dependent on sort of Catholic identity. So he petitions Cranmer. They come up with a lawsuit to do so, and they bring in all of these scholars legal scholars and lawyers to get this Reformation to occur. So the idea here is to make the king the head of the English church. So if you could please, I will turn our attention here. So in 1534, Parliament passes a document called the Act of Supremacy. Now, the Act of Supremacy is a law that gives the king the head of the church, right? So, albeit the king's majesty justly and rightfully is and ought to be the supreme head of the church of England, right? So it's important for us to notice here that they're not saying the whole religion, right? We're talking very, very specifically the church in England. And the reason for that is this. The reason for this is the only supreme head of the Church of England, right, should be should be him, right? And that is because as all honors, dignities, preeminences, jurisdictions, privileges, authorities, immunities, profits, and commodities to the said dignity of the supreme head of the church, same church, belongs and appertaining to the Lord, right? The idea here is Lord being the king, right? The logic here is the King of England is the king of everything in this realm, right? The king is the head of everything in England. Because the king is the head of everything in England, therefore the king must be the head of the church in England. So it's basically just moving the head of the church from the Pope to the king. And again, you can see some of these things here, right? And this is sort of saying that all of his successors will become the heads of the church, meaning that, sort of by extension, all leaders, all kings and queens of England have to be Protestant, right? By the very nature, they cannot be Catholic. So again, this is establishing a change, right? And if you want, you can certainly look at this document here. Now, it's important for you to notice that this does not mean that everybody was on board with this, right? There are people who disagree with this. And for instance, St. Thomas More, who becomes sainted by the Catholic Church, was Sir Thomas More, right? He was opposed to the Church of England and believed that there should have been ways to remedy the relationship between England and the Catholic Church. But Henry then goes on an anti-Catholic campaign. And what he does is starts to confiscate land from the Catholic Church and bring it to himself, right? So today, Queen Elizabeth II is the largest landowner in England and Scotland and Ireland, right? The largest landowner in the United Kingdom, partly because of this, right? They take so much land from the Catholic Church. Henry then begins to translate the Bible into English, and starts to, again, push the English church away from the Pope. But it's important for you to understand, right? They are not changing theological problems with the Catholic Church, right? They are not, changing ideas of sacraments. The sort of consubstantiation does not come in, right? There's still transubstantiation. There's a lot of things that they still keep, and a lot of times people consider the Church of England to be sort of Catholic light. A lot of the same principles, a lot of the same theology, just really different, very, very nuanced differences. What follows from this then is really a lot of different issues here, right? You have Edward VI. So Henry has a daughter with Catherine, his first wife, Mary. He begins a relationship with a woman named Anne Boleyn. She is pregnant when he marries her. They have a child named Elizabeth, and Anne's daughter is Elizabeth. Now, just like Catherine, Anne has a lot of problems with pregnancies. She has a lot of miscarriages. She has a lot of issues bearing children. And Henry actually blames her for this, right? Again, in a time where there's no, biology is really very rudimentary. There can be no proof of sort of what's going on. So Henry blames Anne for her infertility and her pregnancy problems, and he winds up having Anne beheaded because of this. She is, as I say, executed. He marries again, and finally there's a son, right, Edward. Now Edward is a sickly child, and he becomes king in 1547 at the age of 10. Now, just like Henry VIII, right, he really wants to model himself on this sort of reformed religion, and he brings in a lot of Protestant leaders. Remember, he would be Protestant because his father, at the time of his birth, right, 1537, we are 3 years into the Church of England. He dies at a young age. He dies at the age of 16. His oldest sister, Mary, the daughter of Catherine, comes in. Now, Mary is a devout Catholic. She is the niece of, at this point, the Holy Roman Emperor, and she goes on an anti-Protestant rampage. She winds up killing a lot of Protestants, winds up killing a lot of other people as well, and really pushing Catholic policies. She marries her distant cousin, Philip, who is the king of Spain, and a devout Catholic as well. So anyway, this brings in a lot of problems. Finally, the person who succeeds her is Elizabeth I, who is a major, who puts a little bit more, who is a major figure, right? She's queen for 44 years, and she is less concerned about religious issues, and she really brings in an air of religious tolerance. But I really want to put, and this will begin a lot of problems. These sort of religious back and forths and religious issues will bring about a lot of problems in England, Scotland, and Ireland, and Wales in the 1600s, right? And this will create a lot of distrust and create a lot of problems within distrust of different religious groups in the future. So the English Reformation is really, as I say, a political change, right? Theologically, they are not very different, but politically they are. And again, this will have major impacts domestically in England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales.